Final Fantasy XIII isn't a game I ever thought I'd be talking about. After all, I'm not a member of Blistered Thumbs. I'm an animation reviewer, not a video game reviewer. But the truth is, Final Fantasy is actually a very important franchise to me. But after having played 13, witnessing the follow-up in 13-2, and now hearing about the third in the series known as Lightning Returns, I feel very compelled to discuss my feelings on this in the first of the trilogy of the 13 games. Before I dive in, I want to address the fact that many people have suggested that lots of people dislike Final Fantasy XIII because it's popular to do so, or it's the cool thing to do. And they're right, it does seem like people will blindly hate because the game is popular and it's cool to hate it. But I don't want you guys to be like that. I don't want my review or anyone else's review to dictate what you feel about any given piece of media, including Final Fantasy XIII. That having been said, this review is a lot more than just hating the game because it's popular. I instead propose to you the idea that Final Fantasy XIII is not cut from the same cloth as its predecessors and therefore does not contain the elements necessary to include it as part of the main Final Fantasy family. But before we begin with 13, we need to begin by understanding that this game had incredibly huge shoes to fill. As many fans can tell you, this giant franchise name in gaming started with meager roots when the first in the series was released on the Famicom in 1987 and on the NES in 1990 under the company Square. The joke in the title is that the main planner, Hironobu Sakaguchi, was working on this game, which would either make or break both the company and his career. The irony is that this role-playing game found significant success, and the franchise has become a powerhouse that has managed to survive for 25 years. 14 games in the core numeric series and a ridiculous amount of spin-off titles have been released. The US even got a few Final Fantasy games that weren't really Final Fantasies, but the localization team figured they wouldn't sell unless they had a famous name like Final Fantasy on them. Finally, Final Fantasy XIII arrives both on PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 on December 17th, 2009 in Japan and March 9th, 2010 in the States. It was the first, and as of the release of this video, the only Final Fantasy release on this current generation of video game consoles, with Final Fantasy XIV Online still PC only despite the team's efforts to release it for the PS3, and no sign of a Final Fantasy XV anywhere on the horizon. 13 is polarizingly different from the series' previous installments. One could argue that this could be for any number of reasons, but I'll cite one particularly large one. Many elements of the game might have benefited greatly from having some input from the one and only Hironobu Sakaguchi. See, back in 2001, Sakaguchi made his one fatal mistake, and that was building Square Pictures, a Squaresoft movie studio in Hawaii, and releasing a financial failure of a movie, Final Fantasy: The Spirits Within. I honestly didn't hate the movie, but the honest truth was that it wasn't what everybody was expecting. It just wasn't a Final Fantasy. Maybe if it had just been titled The Spirits Within, rather than adding the illustrious Final Fantasy to the title, it wouldn't have been the biggest box office flop in animated movie history. So it's not surprising that after such a large financial blow and the shutting down of Square Pictures, that Hironobu Sakaguchi stepped down from his position as an executive vice president at Square in 2003. By that point, Square was already desperate. Final Fantasy X-2 was the last project Sakaguchi saw involvement in, and it was an obvious cry for help. Scantily clad babes, reusing models, monsters, and locations, the game was definitely there to make a quick buck. And shortly thereafter, in 2004, competing game company Enix, known best for their competing RPG series Dragon Quest, swooped in and swallowed up Square in a merger that called the company Square Enix. Some say Sakaguchi's move with The Spirits Within put Square in a position to be bought out, while others actually say the real reason for the merger was that it was going to happen anyway, and that the stunt Sakaguchi pulled nearly made Enix pull out of the deal altogether. Nevertheless, a new company was formed and Final Fantasy was never going to function the same ever again. Since Sakaguchi's leaving Square, he created a new company, Mistwalker, which has produced some very notable JRPG titles, including Blue Dragon, Lost Odyssey, and The Last Story. So Sakaguchi is still out there making many games that have managed to retain the feeling of classic Final Fantasy titles. It also helps that he's kept his composer buddy, Nobuo Uematsu, very close to continue to compose music for his games. Since the merger, Uematsu has also worked with Square Enix very little, as he produced almost nothing for 12 and absolutely nothing for 13. He did compose the whole score for 14 though, which was the first time he'd scored a full Final Fantasy soundtrack in 10 years. So why am I telling you all this? Because it's important for you to understand everything that Final Fantasy was and everything that Square Enix lost prior to the release of Final Fantasy XIII. To this day, the franchise has sold more than 100 million units worldwide and even held 7 Guinness World Records in 2008 before 13 was released. So when your game series is that popular, expectations are high. I admit, I had even been skeptical of Final Fantasy XII's release. It played differently from the previous games, was based on a game that had been a spin-off of the franchise, and most importantly, it had no involvement from Sakaguchi or Uematsu. But the truth was, the game was solid, and while it wasn't my favorite in the franchise, it actually did manage to retain the feeling of being a Final Fantasy. So why is it then that they were able to capture the magic in Final Fantasy XII, but not in 13? It's finally time to stop talking history and start talking Final Fantasy XIII. Now, the way I've been building this up, I can understand how you might think I have nothing to like about this game. So before I get any deeper, let me talk about a few elements I actually do like. Well, for starters, there's this. Yeah, I know, what a letdown for the best part of the game to be the title screen. Well, let me clarify. Actually, the music playing right here is my favorite part of the game. I also like the variations of this same theme.
You're kidding, right?
The voice acting cast is very competent, and I have very few complaints as to the abilities of the actors. However, I must say that it's sometimes hard to tell just how good they are when they had to perform the script that was given to them.
Yeah, well, hell's not sounding too bad, because this place ain't exactly paradise.
You can't leave me here. You've got to take me with you.
I'm an orphan. I barely got to know my family. But someday, I'm gonna have my own.
There's also this little mech piloting segment. That part's pretty cool. Too bad that part is so terribly brief. And as you might have imagined, the game is gorgeous to look at, and it especially stands out on the platform it was primarily intended on release for, the PlayStation 3. This also marks the first time the English voice acting has had the character lip movements properly synced up with it 100% of the time, which is notable in a Final Fantasy. But you would expect things like breathtakingly gorgeous graphics out of Square Enix for their flagship series. So that means that the different elements of the game have to be really solid in order for this game to be in any way notable. Much of the core production staff had only worked on recent Final Fantasies. The director himself had only worked on Final Fantasy X and X-2. There was also character designer and belt and zipper enthusiast Tetsuya Nomura to thank for the character designs. Thankfully, we had Yoshinori Kitase as the producer, who had worked on Final Fantasies 5 through 8. Also, with Nobuo Uematsu gone, we have Masashi Hamauzu fully composing 13's soundtrack. He's composed for a few other Square Enix franchises, but prior to 13, the only Final Fantasies he'd scored in any capacity for were 10 and Final Fantasy VII, Surge of Cerberus. I'm sorry. I mean Dirge of Cerberus. All of this combined with the fact that a demo of the game had already been released to Japanese audiences just a little more than half a year before the game was set to fully release, before Nomura suggested, "We'd better figure out how our game is supposed to look and feel," suggests to me that the majority of the staff really had no clue what to do when given the task to create a true main entry in the Final Fantasy series. Because of all this and much more, it's obvious that standard things that make a Final Fantasy really feel like a Final Fantasy got completely lost. Section A. Who are you and what have you done with my Final Fantasy? As I just mentioned, so many members of the production staff seemed misplaced, and production of the game appears to have been very rushed near the end, which could only have caused some notable Final Fantasy elements to suffer. Now, it's important to note that I'm not expecting a carbon copy of the previous Final Fantasy games. After all, if we did that, we would have 14 different copies of Final Fantasy I, and that would be awful. But if you have a well-known franchise that's also well-known for certain elements it holds, it's best not to remove those or your game becomes wholly unrecognizable as being part of the franchise's family. Exhibit A1, Audio Cues. The things you know about the way Final Fantasy is supposed to sound is completely gone. Yeah, the soundtrack is different from game to game, but certain things that the creators had trained your brain to recognize in every game had always carried over. 13 is completely devoid of at least 3 key tracks: the prelude, victory fanfare, and the incredibly aptly named Final Fantasy. Every previous installment in the series had these audio cues at some point, even if they didn't always play where you expected them to. Even the floundering Final Fantasy XIV feels more like a Final Fantasy than 13 does, because it at least managed to utilize those familiar sounds every game in the series should have. Can a Final Fantasy game without the song Final Fantasy in it really be called a Final Fantasy? Rather than sounding like this... the audience would have felt much more familiar and comfortable if things sounded more like this. Of the victory fanfare after battles is especially jarring. This in particular is a moment where there's something specific you're expecting to hear and you don't get it. Imagine if this happened in other franchises, like Star Wars for example. Now I know it's hard to imagine the prequels being any worse than they already were, but just hear me out for a second. Imagine it's 1999 and you're in a theater waiting for episode 1 to start. You're waiting for that glorious, familiar opening crawl, and then this happens. Sitting there in your seat with your jaw on the floor going, this isn't Star Wars at all. That's exactly how I feel about the lack of familiar audio cues in Final Fantasy XIII. There actually are 2 versions of the classic Chocobo theme in the game. However, there are so many liberties taken with the melody in places that they're barely recognizable as the song they're trying to be. Plus, one version now has lyrics, a completely unnecessary addition in my opinion. Exhibit A2, Discovery. What do I mean by discovery? I mean absolutely everything that could possibly be construed as discovery. Final Fantasy has long been known for its wide open worlds full of magic, mystery, and things that you're motivated to come back and see even if the game didn't specifically tell you to go do it. This is practically non-existent in 13. Except for the handful of exceptions in the giant open field down on Grand Pulse, you will never do anything that the game's storytelling didn't railroad you into doing. Speaking of railroading, welcome to the most linear map traveling in the franchise's history. As I'm sure you've heard in countless reviews before mine, you're gonna be running in a straight line for about 90% of this game. Your map is nothing but long stretches of hallways and corridors with the occasional twist or turn in them, and you will never be able to divert from these paths to look at other areas that may seem cool. The part about this that I find so crazy is that not only are you given an in-depth map to look at this straight line that you couldn't possibly get lost in, but you also have a mini-map of the area you're running through up in the corner of the screen at all times. Not only that, but things that you would typically imagine to be hidden for the sake of discovery are no longer hidden. The maps display the location of exits and platforms where you'll hit your next cutscene, and even the locations of nearby treasure chests. I guess that shows just how big of a secret treasure is. Of course, when I say treasure chest, I mean floating treasure ball. Seriously, what is that thing? It sort of looks like Wheatley or any of those other ball nodes from the Portal series. You know, Final Fantasy X suffered many of the problems I'm mentioning here in 13. There was little branching off from the railroaded path, and there was always a mini-map in the corner guiding you to your next destination. But 10's problems were significantly fewer. The camera was fixed in certain places along the terrain, and treasure chests weren't marked, so clever camera angles oftentimes managed to keep treasure chests a secret. Unlike 13, where you can pan the camera around you at any time and see everything that your character logically shouldn't be able to see. You know what else 10 had? Airship Travel. It was incredibly limited, as you could only point at a spot on the world map and then just sort of teleport to that spot and assume the airship brought you there. This lets you visit new areas the game didn't necessarily tell you to visit, and you can revisit locations you've already been to. This function is entirely non-existent in 13. Sure, you end up on an airship for a little bit, but you don't ever get to use it. The whole airship thing is just another common Final Fantasy staple that's completely lost in 13. Exhibit A3, People. Keeping with the theme of the last exhibit, there are absolutely no towns to visit or explore. This means you run into very few NPCs. The ones you do run into are in very select locations, and they wholly ignore you. You will, however, overhear their conversations as you walk past them, but when I can't directly communicate with them, have them point me towards something cool, or help them complete a side quest, the inclusion of NPCs feels hollow and meaningless, and I feel neither rewarded nor immersed in the world being presented to me. A lack of towns and having your NPCs only in little clumps largely spaced out from one another make this world feel largely uninhabited. I'm talking about the region known as Cocoon, a place filled with technology and neon lights and huge mass transit systems and the most incredible theme park you've ever seen. Even though it's clearly evident that people are supposed to live in this bustling metropolis, you don't ever get a sense of what day-to-day life is like for these people, or whether or not they're satisfied with things the way they are. Supposedly, the production team had wanted Cocoon to feel a lot like America so as to appeal to a Western audience. They wanted to accomplish this by creating a quote-unquote melting pot full of different ethnicities and cultures. Well, obviously Square Enix completely missed their mark because this idea never came across to me as I was playing, and in fact I had no idea that this was even their intention until I had finished the game and started my research for this review. I don't know, maybe they would have actually accomplished their goal if they had actually put people in their game that I could have interacted with. Oh, and get this, there actually were plans to put towns in the game, but they decided to cut them because they didn't know how to make it as visually appealing as the rest of the game they had been developing. Isn't that both the funniest and the saddest thing you've ever heard? Square used to put their all into making well-rounded Final Fantasies with great story, great gameplay, and great visuals to help present the story to the player. Now they're only capable of creating one of those things, and it's the most shallow and soulless one of the three.